Can I start by congratulating everybody that made it here to the final session? I'm really grateful for so many of you coming when so few of our panelists have managed to make it to the final session. But we have got 3 panelists here. My name is Lawrence Pratchett. I'm from the University of Canberra. I'm not an expert on tourism, but I used to be Dean of our business school at University of Canberra, and I did have tourism within my faculty. So I did take the time to speak to some of my tourism experts back in Canberra before I came. A couple of opening comments that I want to make about the tourism industry in Asia. Probably those of you who are very interested in tourism already know these figures, but I'm going to repeat them anyway, just so that we've all got a context. Roughly a billion, just over a billion people are tourists every year. Sometimes that's the same people more than once, but a billion tourists every year. Half of those go to Europe, or are within Europe, but a quarter of all tourists, or 23%, come to Asia, or Asia and Pacific. So it's not Asia Pacific as in the west coast of America, but it is Asia and the Pacific Islands and so on. In 2014, 263 million people were tourists in Asia. They accounted, as I said, about 23% of the global tourism industry, but interestingly, 30% of the global receipts in 2014. That was $377 billion, apparently. Tourism is a major export for virtually every country in the world. Overall, it ranks 4th in the world, but for many Asian countries, it's the first and most important export. So it's important to think of tourism not simply as something we do with our leisure, but something which is a major industry, worth about $1.5 trillion, I'm told. The second thing I wanted to point out is that Southeast Asia in particular has seen incredible growth in terms of its tourism attraction in the last 5 to 6 years. Grown by 49% between 2010 and 2015 were the figures I was given, but I understand that it's still continuing to grow at a similar rate even now. The third point I wanted to make is really around China, and Kay and I have been talking a little bit about this before we sat down as well. But China has, as we all know, has become a significant investor in tourism. The growth in Chinese tourists coming to all parts of the world, but particularly to Asia, is phenomenal, really. In 2016, more than 20 million Chinese people visited Asia, contributing $261 billion to the Asian economy in that year. It's been the top spender into the Asian economy since 2012 in terms of tourism. If we take Singapore as an example, Singapore gets about 17 million visitors a year, of which in 2017, 3.2 million were Chinese. I think if you go back 15 years, there were hardly any Chinese visitors to Singapore. So what we see is a significant impact of Chinese visitors in particular in Asia. And if I take my own country, Australia, we get more than 1 million Chinese visitors now per year. And the interesting fact that I've been given about Chinese visitors to Australia is that they, on average, spend 6 times per night on their stay in Australia than the mean average of visitors to Australia. So they are significant contributors to the Australian economy as well. But we also know that with tourism comes a whole set of challenges. This panel is specifically supposed to be talking about infrastructure, and infrastructure is a challenge to making tourism work, particularly in Asia, where there hasn't always been a tradition of people traveling and visiting as much. So airports, hotels, restaurants and so on are all important parts of the physical infrastructure that are required. Good public transport from airports into cities and so on. I have spent hours trying to get into Kuala Lumpur before now from the airport and so on. They put you off being a tourist if it takes so long to travel. So creating that infrastructure is important. Having the right forms of attraction that will bring tourists, not less necessarily in large numbers, but will actually provide the experiences that they want. Coping with the disasters that afflict many countries. We know the physical disasters around volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis and so on that have had an impact on the tourism industry in Asia, but also the medical disasters like SARS, which have at times affected the tourism industry, again in Asia, but also globally. So thinking about those types of things are really important. And of course, the governance of tourism is important. I'm going to give you a very quick story here. I'm very fortunate as a senior person at the University of Canberra to visit Bhutan regularly because we have a partnership there. Bhutan is an interesting country for tourism. I don't know how many of you know this, but they have a law which requires you to spend per person $250 per day, US dollars per day in the country. And you have to show receipts to do that. You have to book through a tourism company. That means that they restrict very much who goes into the country, not by making a decision around race, not by making a decision around age, but just simply by putting a significant tax in effect on the tourist. It means that they get high quality tourism and very small numbers, but it's actually high quality in terms of the money that it brings into the country. And it means that the ecosystem that they have that is attractive to tourists, that is visiting a country which still dresses in traditional clothes, still leaves a traditional life, can be maintained alongside a net import or a net export, I suppose, of tourism that has an impact that they want. So I give you that example as a way of thinking about how tourism in different countries works in different ways. I'm not going to pick on those countries that I think do it badly, but I'm sure you can all be thinking of those countries where they just have an influx of low-cost tourists. Actually, now I think about it, Australia has a tendency to do that, because when I said that Chinese people spend 6 times more than the mean average, that's partly because the majority of tourists to Australia are backpackers who seek to spend as little as possible per day in Australia and seek to work as much as they can. We're quite happy with that because they do contribute to our economy in other ways, but it's a different form of tourism than that you get in Bhutan. The way we're going to run the panel today is that I'm going to ask the ones that haven't arrived to stay silent, and I'm going to ask each of the 3 panelists that we have here to just say briefly, probably not as briefly as I was going to make you comment, a little bit about who you are, what you do, and then to address the panel's 2 key questions, if we can, which is what new models can integrate related industries in the tourism industry, and how shall multi-centre and multi-country tourism be promoted while also protecting fragile ecosystems? Having said that, I think we're more interested in a more general sense about what tourism can contribute to the economies in Asia and how we can actually grow that economy successfully in order to deliver sustainable tourism for the future. I'm going to start with Kei, just because he sat on my left. So Kei Shibata, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kei Shibata. I'm originally from Tokyo, Japan. I was born and raised, and then now I actually have 2 homes now, Singapore and Tokyo, going back and forth every month, 7-hour commute routine. So, and over the last 17 years, so I've been running the company I started. It's an online travel company. It's we have a website called Line Travel JP, and also the Trip 101. The both of the websites is actually consumer-fronted websites. So we basically publish a lot of content. For example, if you are looking for the new idea of the destinations, you come to our websites, and then you can probably find the articles like here's a top 10 things to do in Hong Kong or something. Anyway, so I've been deeply involved in the travel industry for the last 17 years, and particularly wearing the hat of entrepreneurs. and also been deeply involved in the technology times travel. So and then also I also sometimes wear the hat of an angel investor in travel tech startups. So so far I've invested probably like 12 different startups across Asia. Some of them in actually North America as well. And lastly, I am also running one international conference in Tokyo called Web in Travel, which is which focus on technology and travel. And we do this conference every June or July, and then have a company like Expedia, Airbnb, Booking.com, those companies, and then everybody actually get together and talk about the future of travel. So I have like a few different hats to wear, and then I'm happy to actually contribute some from my brain, which is actually trained for the last 17 years.
Thank you, Kay. Diana, can we come to you next, please?
Hello. My name is Diana, and I started a business aviation company 20 years ago. When I first started the company, there was only 2 private jets in Asia, namely in Hong Kong. There was no infrastructure. There was absolutely nothing. And the reason I started that is because my family was courted by one of the manufacturer, one of the biggest business aviation manufacturer in the world. And basically they say, oh, can you help us to sell private jets in Hong Kong, Macau, and China? And my brother took up the assignment without even thinking about it, and he dumped it on me. So I picked up the business contract, and I looked at it, how do I start? All right, and 20 years ago, business aviation is still quite, is quite small in Europe, and North America is quite prevalent at the time. So there was no infrastructure, okay? And very few airports in Asia has accepted, private jets. So I really have to lobby. And at the time, Hong Kong was very bold. They opened a business aviation service center at the newly built Chalapcot Airport. So, and there was one Swiss company that had opened office in Singapore, but absolutely no business. So we put our heads together and basically, start selling the product first. Once you have the demand, once you sell the products, and the services begin to start. Nowadays, we have over 600 aircraft in the region, and the movements per day in Hong Kong. Before it was like 1 or 2 movements a month, 20 years ago. Now you get a couple hundred of movements every day in Hong Kong. So basically what I'm trying to say is even infrastructure, if you have the demand, and then we set up what we call the association, and we start lobbying the different governments and to get governments to, to see the benefits of what this private jet travel, what kind of travelers it will bring. Actually, normally, in the first 10, 15 years, mainly those travelers were investors, major big investor of Fortune 500 companies. They come to Asia, they look at opportunities, and the government realized that if they bring in those people, you get investments. So that's one way of growing the industry. Nowadays, it has becoming quite a habit now for a lot of what we call fund managers to use private jet for fundraising, and also for consumers. People now thinking of going on vacations, So they hire, or the charter private jets. And because of that, the whole industry grow. It becomes a very, one of the biggest employer. And in a lot of, countries. And we are now having a lot of issues. We can't find pilots because pilots are very difficult to find nowadays. Not sufficient mechanics, and even people working in the industry. Now, governments, especially Hong Kong right now, they realize that aviation is a major sector. So they are putting in a lot of money into education. They have built an aviation academy, and colleges are now offering aviation, education and degrees, etc. So it can really spill over to other areas if it's taken the right way. And because I've been in this industry for 20 years, I see, and if you are bold enough, you can create a whole entire new product out of, the private jet travel. And one of the products that we are focusing on right now is medical tourism. So a lot of countries in Asia at the moment, places like Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, they have a very good medical system. And one way, is to promote that, and whether they travel by private jet or not, but it's a way of promoting it. And another sector that we see a lot and is growing is pet travel, because in Asia, your pet can only go into the cargo hold. So, and if you don't want your pet to be traumatized, better hire a private jet. And so private jet travel is becoming quite a novelty now in Hong Kong. And so Japan is one of the recipient countries that is accepting private, people coming over to Japan for, with their pets. And there's quite a lot of hotels that are gearing up to that kind of tourists, okay? So, if you already have some of the infrastructure, all you needed to do is to promote and build some marketing programs on products that you can sell. And another type of products that is becoming quite popular is wellness travel. People, looking for retreats, etc., and they will travel long distance to go to those destinations. And you can always package it up with a type of service and grow the business.
Thank you, Diana. We'll come back to some of those points in a minute, but if I could just go first to Genki. You're going to talk a little bit, I think, about the challenge that I face as a tourist, which, being Australian, I speak Australian really well, some other forms of English a little bit well, and no other languages. So, Genki.
Hi, good day. I'm Genki Goto from Tokyo, and I am CEO, founder and CEO of Kototsuna Inc. That is a multilingual translation company. I am a serial entrepreneur, and my background is e-commerce. I started e-commerce company 25 years ago, and that is health products. That is Kenko.com. That is one of the largest e-commerce company of health products in Japan. And I ran that company for 20 years, and I sold it, and then I started new business. That is Kototsuna Inc. So I'm very brand new of this industry. And why I started this company is that I'm from very rural part of Japan with population of about 40,000 and in Kyushu. And I suppose that in Japan, Japan is very aging countries, and the economical growth is very low these days. So there are very few opportunities to grow in especially rural areas. But I suppose that inbound traveling is one of the biggest opportunity for growth and in those kind of areas. But unfortunately, the people in rural areas are aging and they cannot speak any other languages. So, but I was in e-commerce industry, so I know about the very new technology, including AI and machine translation and those kind of things. So I started new business to eliminate language barrier to facilitate the travel tourism industry. And so my company is now doing the facilitating the cross-messaging platforms messaging. That is, for example, Japanese use Line, and Chinese use WeChat, and Korean use KakaoTalk, and many other people use WhatsApp or Facebook messengers. And we enable the communication between different messaging platforms, for example, between Line and WeChat or KakaoTalk and Facebook Messenger. And then we use machine translation during the communication. So we allow the communication between those kind of different countries. So especially in Asian countries, yeah, the tourists, most of tourists are Asians, and they speak different languages. So the tourism in Asia is very difficult because the language is different, and especially the tourists language capabilities not so high, so they tend to attend the group tour, not FIT. And also the local areas have very low language capability. So yeah, there are the few communication, little communication between local people and tourists. That is, I think that that is one of the problem which causes the less spent money in the, especially the local areas, by individual tourists. So I started the business for multilingual translation 2 years ago. Yeah.
Arigato gozaimasu. We've only got 3 panelists, unless any other panelists have arrived unknowingly. No, in which case, what I'm going to do is keep the conversation going a bit longer with the panelists and then open it up to as many comments and questions as people want to make. As I said at the start, and some of you weren't here at the start, so I will repeat it. You have a comment? Okay. As I said, we're focused on tourism more generally, not just the questions in the pamphlet.
I own some hotels in the region, ranging from Beijing to Hong Kong to Taiwan to Singapore. So one thing that I noticed in customer trends is that younger people are now moving away from the big brands, from the big, generic brands, to try to. I think they're much more adventurous now. Younger people try boutique hotels, local ryokans, and more of a. I think people try for a more local and unique experience, whereas the older generation would, want to stay in these trusted brand hotels and, go for package tours. Young people now increasingly are much more independent, with or without the ability to speak the local language. I think just because we have so much information on the internet, they can plan their own travel. They want unique experiences that they can relish and show off to their friends. And I think this is a trend where I don't know how our industry will adapt to it, but certainly I see that as a mega trend. I don't know if Mr. Shibata, Mr. Goto would agree with me regarding that.
I think that's definitely the trend that everywhere, you see everywhere. And then so our media, it's called Trip 101 in Singapore, it is definitely the one that focus on sort of a new experiences, and then what we call alternative experiences in travel. So, for example, we publish a lot of articles here's a top list of Airbnb properties in the city XYZ, or here's the interesting things to do, local experiences in a city ABC. So we publish a lot of articles, and in those articles, the younger people, like millennials, they love it. And then this trend, you cannot really kind of you can't stop it. And then but I think at the same time, I think legacy hotels, in traditional hotels, also started actually finding their own answers, right? So Accor Hotel, for example, they actually acquired one of the alternative accommodation companies called One Fine Stay. I think that's the one thing. So and the also company like Booking.com, they started actually offering local experiences on their websites. So again, so this trend you cannot stop, and then you need to embrace it. And then for hotel, I think it's a lot of big hotel brands also not only get into the private accommodation business like homes, but also like design hotels, right? So I think if I were the owner of like a traditional hotel chains, I think it's I have to think about offering a different set of properties and then and services to cater towards those young people's needs.
Okay, can I just get you to go to, which I think segues nicely into the other part of the conversation we were having earlier, which is around the extent to which tourists are a homogenous group, and the extent to which, and we were talking particularly about Chinese tourists and the assumption that people have that all Chinese tourists are the same, and I think you sort of disagree with that idea. So I think that segues neatly into what you're talking about in terms of the offer.
Are you talking about the diversity of Chinese?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I mean, so that's interesting. So a lot of people actually think that sort of a stereotype of a Chinese tourists actually they actually travel in a group, right? And then kind of waving flag things. And then they go to maybe the Louis Vuitton shops and then buy the whole bunch of like branded products, and then then they go to the Chinese restaurant for the lunch, no matter where they go. But that's definitely changing quite rapidly now. I think it's there are more and more, like backpacker is a good example. I think there's a website called Mafengo, and also Chonyu. So those two websites are user-generated content websites. It's like a TripAdvisor. It's like you guys all know TripAdvisors, right? It's like a TripAdvisor, but for the Chinese, but particularly for younger generation, and they try to actually find their own experiences in overseas, and then they even exchanges all their different itineraries, and then those are like typical consumer behaviors by those independent Chinese travelers, right? So I think the time is actually changing very, very fast. I think, not only Chinese, but also, across the different countries in Southeast Asia, I think the people definitely have a wide range of interests, and then they go on their own, and then they actually travel independently.
Diana, obviously, people using your services are at the higher end of the tourism chain, food chain, in terms of what they can afford to spend. But do you have a single group of people really that you're catering to, or is it a very diverse range again?
Actually, traditionally, it's the very high end. You're right. But just now, I mentioned that we are trying to, package what we call pack travels. And those target customers are not traditionally rich. It's just that they need to travel with their pet and they will spend the money. So what we do is we consolidate the interest and we say, okay, each month we will have one trip to Japan and it's a 5-day trip and this is how much it costs per person. And we just consolidate the interest. And it's becoming very, very popular because those pet travelers, they love their pets like they are children and they want to take them with them. So it's not necessarily, the ultra rich because once you consolidated, I would say 10 travelers, it becomes quite affordable. Yeah.
I think one of the biggest contributors for Asia to be able to grow the market of tourism is actually the low-cost carriers, low-cost carrier airlines. Like Air Asia, for example, Scoot. So I think it's the that actually triggers the demand of stimulate the demand of travel, particularly for younger generations. And this is also an alternative way to travel too, right? Because back in the days, there are only like a Cathay Pacific, Singapore Airlines, Japan Airlines, All Nippon Airways, those like a legacy national flag carriers. But now, low-cost carriers are everywhere. In Europe, I think is even more. I think you see a Lion Airs, those guys. They basically disrupted the whole industry. And then that, as a result, I think the younger people just really can travel all over the places. And I myself, even I can actually fly Singapore Airlines if I want, but I don't do that. I flew Scoot from Singapore to here. Well, not just because I wanted to save money, but it's just actually it doesn't make sense to pay $1,000 for 2 hours flight, right? So and then I sometimes actually joke about it. If I were running maybe a travel agency business, I want to probably package low-cost carriers and then probably Ritz-Carltons, because you can actually save money on the flights and you can actually spend more money on accommodations, right? So this is another way, another good example of the sort of a wide range of variety of the products available in a market now. I think and the younger people definitely like to adopt that.
Ryanair is interesting actually because Ryanair's business model started, as I understand it, with them reaching out to regional parts of Europe that didn't have high tourism and getting those local municipalities, regions or whatever to invest money to pay Ryanair to land at their local airports. And I've flown to different airports in France and Spain and Italy, which have 2 flights that come a day, both Ryanair flights. That's all they have, and a few small light aircraft that take off from the airfields otherwise. And you go for £1 or €1 on the flight, and it's subsidised by the municipality because the municipality want that tourism revenue to come in. That's where they get their benefits. So it's quite interesting what you're saying, how an interesting business model actually disrupted air travel. I have to confess that I have now flown my last ever Ryanair flight. That's right. But Genki, can I come to you and just ask about, you talk about having built this platform for tourists to be able to speak across Weibo, WeChat, all the various different platforms that different countries are using. But are you actually seeing the take-up of that? Are you actually getting people to use the platforms? Are people actually using these things? What sort of numbers have you got?
We launched that system two months ago. So now currently several thousand users are using. And those use cases are including the for example, tourist information or at the hotel, they want to talk to each other, but it's a little bit difficult to communicate. In that case, they use on face-to-face. And also one of the Yeah, big use cases are that this is not tourism, but Chinese people in China or the expats from other countries in China cannot use Facebook Messenger and Line and those kind of messaging platforms other than WeChat. So they use those kind of our service to connect from WeChat to Line or Facebook Messengers. And also we are now developing some other applications. That is, for example, that one is the broadcasting system. For example, in Japan, Kansai Airport was locked out when the typhoon came in September. And also in Hokkaido, there was the earthquake in September, and many people are locked in Chitose Airport. And in those cases, inbound travelers suffered the very hard time because they cannot communicate well in Japanese. So now we are now developing the new system that we allow the broadcasting to many languages to travelers with in many languages to their own SNS just by scanning QR code. So in that emergency, if they have they display if the airport display the QR code on the wall, then the foreign tourists scan those QR code, then they can get up-to-date information by their own language.
I'm going to just bring us to infrastructure a little bit, and I'm going to come to our fourth panelist, whose name I've suddenly forgotten, even though I've met him before. Give him a tap, will you? because Anson, sorry, Anson, yeah, you can be Salish if you want to. Anson, I want to come back to the point you made though about how young people particularly are wanting different experiences and not using the traditional infrastructure of tourism. How do we then invest in the right infrastructure that will continue to respond to the needs of this new evolving set of tourists?
This is always interesting because, you know, as business people, we always want scalability. That's why, you know, Mr. Shibata talks about these big Chinese tourist groups. It's easy, it's profitable to entertain busloads of people who want to just buy the same stuff, eat the same food, and follow the same tour guide. And we get lazy that way. Or else we go to the high end and just cater to those who like to fly their pets because they have no kids or they hate children, right? So these are the two ends of the market. But I think honestly, these markets are due for correction. You know, you're right, Mr. Shibata. I think the Chinese market is evolving very fast, right? The Chinese market is evolving very fast in that the older generation who is not very savvy are likely to be replaced by more worldly citizens, educated in the West, speak some English, and want those new experiences, just like young people from the West, you know, because the blogs, what they call the key opinion leaders, KOLs, bloggers, they write in many different languages and they share their unique experiences. And here comes the challenge as hotel owners, as tour operators. How do we do what is called mass customization? That is the challenge. You know, not everybody will be able to afford to rent or buy a private jet. You know, not everybody's going to be able to travel with their pets. Most people cannot even afford to raise a pet because they work, you know, during the day and they don't have a maid at home. So how do we do mass customization? Meaning scalability, but personalize those trips. Now, a lot of younger people, they're so internet savvy that they book everything themselves directly with these small business owners in hard to find places. In fact, there's almost a one-upmanship among young people when they post on WeChat, their friend circle, or Facebook. They want to post unique experiences. That there's a one-upmanship to say, hey, I discovered this thing. I discovered unique item. I discovered unique fishing hamlet. I discovered a unique experience. You should try it. There's a certain pride of ownership for people, younger people, all over the world. India, China, Japan, America, Europe, Australia. Some of them like extreme sports. Others like unique scenery, unique wildlife. And they post this stuff, and they share this with their friends, and they say, have you tried it? And then I think it's going to be a challenge for tour operators, for hotel owners to try to cater to this group. And this is because our infrastructure is stuck in that mass communication age where, I talk to a lot of hotel owners, they don't know how to advertise. I have trouble spending our own advertising budget. Do we spend it on online banner ads? That's a thing of the past. How do we find the right key opinion leaders or bloggers to invite them to come into our hotels to write about their experience of staying in our hotels and make it interesting or exciting? So this is, I think, the challenge.
I think you brought up a very fundamental potential problem for the society. Because when you think about the capacity of hotels, for example, it's funny what's happening in Japan, for example. So we have a World Cup rugby coming up next year, and then in 2020 we have a Tokyo Olympics coming up, right? And then people are going crazy, so we don't have enough hotels, right? So the government included. So all of a sudden, people start investing a lot of money, building a new hotels. But at the same time, there's a statistics, I think there's some 13% or something of the entire houses in Japan are empty, right? Because the population is aging and decreasing, right? So a lot of houses actually empty now, right? Why? So when you look at the whole hardwares, houses, buildings, I think we have enough assets. Why you have to invest again? It's scary to actually spend on a capex again, right? If you're running a business, I think sharing economy is such a great thing, and then it is still early age. Airbnb is actually definitely facing some challenges because of the regulations. And then what's that?
Japanese government is basically banned Airbnb.
No, they didn't. They actually, they actually.
It's impossible extremely difficult to be an Airbnb person.
Right. So no. What happened earlier this year is actually so they first of all Airbnb was in a gray area, right? So there was no regulations. So earlier this year, why?
Why do you need regulations?
Why didn't?
Why do you need regulations?
Yeah, well, of course, because if you are a hotel owner, so you need to compete with them, right? So you need to have a level field, right? You need to have a level field. As I think that's a great idea to actually regulate in a good way. But right now, I think it's the new regulation is actually probably a little bit tougher than everybody expected. So that's why a lot of homeowners or real estate owners actually having a tough time to run the Airbnb businesses. But what I also heard that the government is actually now reconsidering to deregulate. And so again, so this is actually still early stage for the sharing economy. Uber, same thing, right? Uber, a lot of challenges for Ubers all over the world. So I think it's, the longer term, I think it may be 10 years, 20 years down the road, I think this sharing economy is definitely going to non-stop. But right now, I think it's just in the period where lots of things is actually changing, and then some hiccups, some what is that called, a pain in early days is definitely underway now, I think.
So this isn't a. Sorry, you want to?
Yeah.
Please go on.
To be honest, the old industries do not like those kind of newcomers. And I have experience that I sued the government and I won at the Supreme Court for the rule change when I did e-commerce. And And at that time, also the old people tied with politicians and bureaucrats, and they changed, they somehow bent the law and ordinary. And so those kind of issues still remains in Airbnb and also Uber issues.
So I'm also not convinced that the share economy is here to stay. I see a number of large companies taking over aspects of the share economy on Airbnb and so on. So you end up booking hotels through Airbnb these days and so on if you're not careful. But can I open it up to comments and questions from around the floor? Yes, please. And we'll go anywhere you want to, as long as it has a vaguely tourist related point.
Well, thanks very much. Phil O'Reilly from New Zealand, a small tourism operation in the South Pacific. Lawrence, one of the reasons why your tourism spend so low is that your second biggest tourism market is New Zealand, and of course, and they all come over and stay with friends and family, so we're all cheap when we deal with you. My question, and I'm interested in any thoughts people around the table might have, is on the social license to operate of tourism. We're having an issue in New Zealand. We've now got 400 and some odd, maybe 500,000 Chinese tourists coming to New Zealand each year. Many of them go through little towns that were designed for about 5,000 people, and they all go to the local toilet and want to get a cup of coffee and put a lot of strain on the infrastructure, and we kind of love them at one level, but those people in those small towns, the most picturesque small towns you can imagine, of course, aren't all that happy with this happening. And we've all got stories when we were kids going to beaches where no one was, and now we go to those same beaches. We can't walk around those beaches now because they're full of tourists. So that's good for New Zealand. We're making a lot of money and it's fantastic, but it does cause issues around social license, and then you run into a rather similar issue. Some of you have been raising it, which makes the problem even more complex, and that is that many of the people coming to New Zealand now want to have very unique experiences. One in the newspaper just last week, the latest thing that the kids will be taking photos of on Instagram is you can lie down with a cow, a dairy cow, and you can cuddle a cow in a paddock. Now, I wouldn't do that if I were you, but anyway, some people want to do that. So you've got this problem of pressure and tension on particularly small town New Zealand, and at the same time a desire for people to see this unique part of New Zealand, which is literally places that go to a place that you can't do anything. That's the only place you can do it in the world, so this unique idea plus the challenge of scale. So I'm interested in any thoughts people have about that, whether they're facing some of those issues. I know Vietnam faces some serious issues around social license to operate given the pressure on the tourism sector here. Any thoughts about that? Any thoughts about how we might be able to overcome that?
I just want to relate that to Anson's point, because I'd written down while we were thinking around key opinion leaders and how that puts pressure on particular areas. And thinking about New Zealand, of course, you had Lord of the Rings, I mean, probably very good for the South Island particularly to some extent, but also put, I think, a lot of pressure on a few key places where bits of the film were filmed and so on. And key opinion leaders do exactly the same thing and put stress on small ecosystems quite often in ways that are almost unacceptable. How do we manage that problem of the unique experience, which becomes completely non-unique once 1,000 people have all stood in the same place and had the same selfie?
I can suggest something, but it's not likely to be popular because I think municipalities can do lotteries like Bhutan. Bhutan heavily regulates the number of tourists. They auction these things off. It could cost a lot. That means if you're a backpacker, you're not well-to-do, chances are you cannot go to Bhutan. So one way to ration this is by having permits. They have hunting permits, fishing licenses, and in the case of Bhutan, entry visas, which are very pricey. Now, this is not going to be popular because that smacks of elitism. And soon you're going to have Diana's clients bringing their pets who would occupy and buy these licenses instead of a hardworking but not so well-to-do youngster because they cannot afford the license.
But
so
they're not going to go to Bhutan for their medical treatment. I can tell you that. But
Hello, so my name is Miko. I come from the Philippines. So, as you may well know, that Boracay Island was shut down, right? So, I have some friends who actually live in the island. They run hotels, they run the tourism business. So, of course, they do have now entry permits to limit the number of people who are allowed on the island. I remember visiting Boracay when there was barely any people, you know. To some extent, it changed the experience. There was pollution, but at the same time, it was also good for business. I understand from my friends that running a small mini hotel at that island raked in more revenues than some friends from Manila, you know. So to some extent, it was both good for business, but also, if not regulated properly, bad for the environment. Now, of course, they reopened the island a few weeks ago. And then now, but not all the infrastructure work has been put in place. So they did try to widen the roads. Of course, it had to destroy some establishments along the way. But again, I think this is with the hope of actually trying to rehabilitate or correct a lot of mistakes that have happened. That said, I have heard that they are planning to shut down a few other places as well. Currently, it's they're trying to limit the number of people. So that's correct. So I remember I have some office mates who, upon opening, within the first week they were there. You know, so and they did say that they do check whether you have a booking there. They do try to validate. They now really limit the amount of people there in that island. So. Now, of course, this makes me wonder how sustainable this will eventually be. How will it now change the investments that have been done? I remember that when I think it was like 2 weeks before they shut down the island, I was also there. And there were a lot of uncertainty with regard to tour operators. Should we still continue selling tickets? Because will it really last for 5 months or will it extend further than that? You know. So I think having that kind of clarity, I think both from the government standpoint and of course from all the people and stakeholders involved will be very, very important. But I just wanted to add to that point on like how it stresses, let's say, the environment. There was always this environmental tax that they have when you enter, like 100 pesos. You know, it's a very small amount, but it's supposed to help maintain whatever things that they were doing. But it was not exactly enough to really address the large infrastructure-related concerns that was happening in the island.
I mean, that almost speaks to, that's both the, oh, sorry, John, did you want to come in on something? You were waving your hand, John. I was just going to say that what Nico was saying speaks to some extent to that infrastructure problem, but also to the social license again. And I really like the expression social license here, because I think it really sort of suggests about how tourism is to some extent imposed on communities. And certainly I was in Mumbai earlier this year where the hotel that I was staying in was advertising tours around the India's biggest slum. And that seemed to me to be the most extreme form of tourism I could think of, and probably the least satisfying form of tourism I could think of as well. But John, go.
Yeah, I've done that slum tourism and also in Jakarta. I recommend it. But back on to Boracay, which is the same problem that Indonesia has with Bali. You know, Indonesia has many tourists going, but 50% of Indonesia's tourists go to Bali, even though Indonesia has 17,500 islands. And it seems to me that Boracay, I mean, you've got one beautiful island there, but you've got 7,000 other islands. Isn't part of the solution governments developing other destinations and promoting other destinations when you patently have so many other destinations that are attractive? And people are crazy about Boracay, but I come from Sydney in Australia, and quite honestly, the Boracay beach is nice, but it's not fantastic. There are many other ones in the Philippines that could be developed.
Can I just quickly add? So I'm Janine, and I'm currently in education, but before I was a hotelier for quite a long time. My company, I was in the headquarters, so I was covering 1,200 hotels. So I've seen how they've crowded to Bali, right? And I've also worked in the Maldives, and those two places have something in common, right? Which is very fragile ocean or the very fragile kind of ecosystem, yeah. And my experience in Bali versus my experience in Maldives is completely different. In Maldives, their diver or the diving instructor would tell us, okay, never to touch anything underwater. And there are marine biologists who explain us different things. However, in Bali, when I was diving, the diving instructor will be like, "Oh, you want to touch that? Oh, go ahead to touch it." Or, "Oh, this is my stick. I'm just gonna poke it to see how it goes." Right? So, I think while the quota thing is not really, it's not popular, but how about the industry itself being more responsible and acting in a more sustainable way, right? So if there's a tourist, throwing things in the beach, how about telling them not to, right? So in the Maldives, we've done it quite well, and the resorts are quite, together in protecting the fragile ecosystem. But sadly, in Bali or in the Philippines, I don't see the same thing. And then to the poverty tourism. Because now I work with the underprivileged people and I ask them how they feel about it, actually they don't feel quite good. And they felt like they were in a zoo.
Really?
Yes, they felt dehumanized. And there is another form of tourism coming up, which is on top of slum tourism, it's poverty tourism, where tourists wants to go to help out in the orphanage. And I guess a lot of you who live in developing countries know that people running those orphanages often take advantage and try to make the kids live in really sad looking as possible so that they will get more money. And a lot of times those money don't really get to the kids. So I would really ask everyone to do those tours really with high caution.
I apologize.
I think, ultimately, we are a world becoming, there are more and more people who can afford to travel. And what Mr. Shibata said about, discount airlines, it creates even bigger market. And Airbnb does the same. It democratizes travel. And we're going to have to come to terms with that, either, in the form of a raffle. Like, for instance, if I go to Broadway, let's say New York, and I want to see a show, you either pay through the nose to buy a ticket to a popular show, or there's a raffle lottery system, and so not everybody gets to go. Or in the alternative, much like hunting licenses, fishing licenses, or Boracay passes, you got to charge extra for it to use pricing and the market mechanism to limit people. And it's not going to be a popular thing to say, but to save the ecological system, something needs to be done. I do not think that the current wave of new countries with rising middle class, mass tourism, hitting all the major popular spots, and those spots are yet to be discovered, but soon by bloggers, and so popularized very quickly. If we don't deal with that, soon we're going to start losing habitats and unique ecological systems pretty damn fast.
Yeah, please keep going.
Just as a way of responding to all of that, it's pretty hard to limit numbers into a country like New Zealand. It's a big place, so it's not like Bhutan. But actually what we found, just to contribute back to the conversation, we found we have actually got some rationing going on. If you try and find a hotel room in Auckland in February, well, good luck. Even I can't find a hotel room in February, and I go all the time, right? And the price will be triple what I normally pay for it. So effectively some rationing going on. If you want to see some marketing for New Zealand tourism in the high summer, you won't see any. All of the marketing is in the shoulder season and in the off season in winter. We've got an incredible growth of events, cultural events and indoor events and so on, to attempt to attract both domestic and overseas tourists in the off season and our winter to New Zealand. That's all part of it as well. And we do have rationing on some of our national parks and national walks, and some of our iconic experiences. There is effectively rationing because you simply can't fit that many people on the walk. For example, the route burn or the Milford track, you simply can't do it. The other point I'd make is that we have the point about people raping the environment. There's a bit of that that's gone on, but increasingly what we're finding is that tourists appreciate being told not to do that. They appreciate being told, hey, listen, can you be careful, please, because it needs to be here for your children. We want them to see this magnificent sight when they come back as well. So a classic example of that, two very famous glaciers in New Zealand, the Fox and the Franz Josef, are both remarkable glaciers that end up in rainforest. So you can walk off bush into a glacier. Now, they've been naturally going backwards for a few years now, but people used to be able to walk on them. As a kid, I could walk on them. You can't now because they're too fragile, and everybody gets told that and understands that. So tourists actually appreciate that. Not all Chinese tourists do, and that causes some challenges from a license to operate issue. Some of the low-level tourists don't. But increasingly, we're using many of the tools that are being talked about around here with some success, and we're just about to introduce a border tax, which I'm not sure is going to work, but nevertheless, we'll give it a go, to try and help fund some of that as well. So we're trying all of those messages, so watch this space.
So, sorry, please, yeah, keep going.
Hello, my name is Nat Wong, and I'm the founder of an organization called Water Inception. I'm really concerned about the environmental damage that tourists are causing, especially around the islands. I think everybody of us realize now how many bottles of plastic end up in the oceans. And I've been on a mission for a couple of months now to try to talk and connect with hotels, resorts, people working in the tourism environment to try to find a way to get rid of PET bottles. And I came here actually to try to introduce a new technology that allows organizations to bottle their own reusable bottles that are made of glass or aluminum. I brought a sample here. And what's great about this is that not only it helps the hotels to reduce their bottle cost, but also to protect the environment. I was wondering around, the people around here, have you been trying to look for such solutions? And what do you think of the development of ecotourism? Is there something that you think is growing or not? Thank you.
I just want to quickly add, my hotels that we used to work with have, I think 10 years or 12 years ago, were using glass bottles, or not aluminum, but mainly glass. Then we got complaints from our clients because they can't bring the bottle along with them on excursions, right? So I think at the end of the day, if today is what the consumer wants, I think the hotel will be more than happy to adopt it, right? So it is more, the onus is more on the consumer rather than hotels, because we've used to do bottles. Sheraton used to do bottles.
But it is interesting how most tourists, for example, use the towels once in their hotel room. They don't keep them and have them for the second day.
Thank you. My name is Tomoko Hoshino from Japan. I'm kind of a world traveler, so I'm very concerned about travel any place. And I requested Miss Matter from Mad Travel from Philippines to come here because they have a very good organization where the traveler to participate as a social business planner when they come to the Philippines and to work as a volunteer to rise any business, social business there. So I like that system. I really love to travel, visit them, but I could not do that. So I asked them to come here. But unfortunately, maybe because of the typhoon or something, they cannot come, unfortunately. But that kind of, next action, not only one-time travel, for example, in Japanese, tabi no haji wa kakisute. It means like any shameful activity in travel will be forgettable. So it's not good for in Japanese word. Yeah. So as a traveler, we have to educate like a kind of rule. For example, I've been to Masai Mara in Africa last month. That time, rangers educate traveler to have a rule in the Masara, the animal conservation area first. So our travelers' action will be, in the regulation is very strict. So that kind of rule, if the real, facilitated side loved the land so well, so I think that is the kind of the regulation will be done any place to be sustainable, to develop sustainable way like you did, and I think so. Just thank you.
It's an interesting paradox emerging here, I think, in our conversation, which is really around how we started off, or I started off anyway, suggesting that how do we grow the tourism industry in Asia from its current pretty strong base to an even stronger base. But we've sort of moved somehow to rationing it, thank you, Anson, and thinking about how we do that with a form of social license to operate, I suppose, among those communities that want it, and also protecting those ecosystems. And I'm wondering whether actually the answer to that is partly rationing, but it's also straightforward not providing the infrastructure that would actually bring the tourists into those areas where we don't want them. So making travel hard, making accommodation hard or limited and so on is one way of actually providing that rationing, because people won't travel. Anson, you're going to respond to that, I can see.
Yeah, you look, governments, local governments will always want more tourism because that means more funding, more income, more revenue. But, tourism, just like any other industry, produces what economists call negative externalities. These are things that people outside the tourism industry has to bear in terms of costs. It's the local inhabitants, it's the local habitat, the local wildlife, the local ecology. So I think municipal and provincial governments need to be responsible and not get too greedy, because there is a natural limit to natural scenery. There's a natural limit even to Broadway in New York and Manhattan. There is no limitless capacity to entertain people. If you try to do that, the quality of the entertainment or the value of the ecosystem, the uniqueness of the habitat will be destroyed, will get altered. So ultimately, I think it's not just to educate tourists, it's also to educate the receiving end, those provincial, municipal governments that are popular destinations, that are trying to develop tourism, to develop it in a responsible way where you don't get too greedy, because if you do, you end up causing your local inhabitants and your local environment sometimes irreparable damage. And that would be sad. That would be sad. Asia is rising, and there is a rising middle class, so naturally, short-haul tourism will rise whether you like it or not. So how do we deal with that in a way that's responsible, not just to ourselves, but to those who follow us, our children, our grandchildren? So they're not just going to see our home movies and say, gosh, that really looked good. How come it looks so bad right now, so degraded?
Sorry to butt in, I'm not a speaker, but there is another path. I agree with some of that, certainly for the more iconic things. I've never been to the Notre Dame in Paris, even though I go there a lot. The reason is the queue is always so long, I just can't be bothered. So there's certainly a case for that kind of thing. But there's another thing too, which I think is making the untrendy trendy. When I was 15 years ago, when I first came to Wellington, New Zealand, where I live, the capital, where the weather is famously awful, windy and raining, and I would have seen one tourist a decade in Wellington. There was nobody, no tourists were there. It was awful. Now, through a whole bunch of investment in the city and the bright ideas of entrepreneurs, within a 10-minute walk from my house in Wellington, I can visit 9 breweries. Microbreweries have taken off in Wellington in a big way. 10 minutes walk, 9 breweries. That's a lot of beer. Now, that has led to Wellington, the most untrendy town you could imagine 15 years ago, now being seen as one of the trendiest cities in Australasia. People go there for the weekend. It's extraordinary, I can't believe it, but it's true. Now, I think there's a real opportunity to develop new product that is exciting and interesting in its own way, and it would be really hard to degrade Wellington, because whatever you put on the street, the rain's going to wash away in 10 minutes' time. So you can actually create new opportunities, I think. So it's not just about limiting numbers, although it is for some product, no question about that. It's also about growing the capacity for the country to accept more tourists in areas which have traditionally been potentially underdone. And another good example of that, a world-famous example, of course, is the example of Provence in France, which was a rural backwater until Peter Mayle wrote his famous novel, and now millions of visitors go there every year, of course, creating all sorts of stress in those little villages and communities. But nevertheless, it's a great example of how you can take an otherwise untrendy piece of France and turn it into one of the greatest tourism products in the world. So there's both ways here.
And I come from Canberra, which is the world's third, according to Lonely Planet, is the world's third most visitable city in 2018. I sometimes wonder what goes on in the minds of Lonely Planet. But are there any final points before we close? I know that Anson has to go to another panel now. He's on the plenary, so.
Maybe I'll just add another story on top of your different examples. So you know when Thailand opened, the first most popular destination apart from Bangkok is Phuket, right? So Phuket is highly populated, crowded, and not that pleasant. And what the Thai government did for some way is completely different, right? So instead of allowing budget flights to come in, they really controlled the flights. So no budget flights in, and only I can't remember, there are only a couple of flights in, right? So with that, they actually managed to create some way into like a premium location where the beaches are always going to be, white powder sand clean versus Phuket. So I guess other than just, yeah. So yeah, but instead of, and for the people who are determined to go, they can take a long bus ride there, right? But you have to be really determined. So instead of using a price point as a determinant, right, it's the inconvenience as the, yes.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt your conversation. Just like I want to share, I'm Japanese, but based in Hanoi in Vietnam. So we have in Vietnam because nobody from Vietnam is a panelist. So in Vietnam we found largest cave in middle of largest cave, Don Xuan Cave, largest cave in the world, and of course like a local government tried to attract tourists to build. Cable and like hotels and everything, like a big tourist community. But this is so beautiful and it's so huge cave. So local people against the movement, and they finally won, and they try to protect the cave. Touchable place. So this is also like you were talking about sustainable development to the tourist. And also in Japan we have like Oze. Oze is a place we need to protect. So limited access to the people. How many people can get access to the whole year? So just to I want to share about Vietnamese story. They have a huge protest movement against the tourism. Of course, local government and the national government want to promote more tourists to Vietnam.
I think that story almost summarizes our conversation in some respects, doesn't it? Because it touches on that social license, it touches on that rationing point, it touches on the ecosystems that we're trying to protect and the sort of long-term sustainability of the tourist industry. So I think on that note, we will wrap up. I do thank you, all of you, for having the resilience to not bow to the peer pressure to go off into Ho Chi Minh City and do some sightseeing, but actually to stay in the session and join the conversation. Can I ask you to join me in thanking our three panelists and everybody else that contributed? So thank you very much.